Now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Mr. Doug Miller, who is the site administrator for Pennsbury Manor. And I would just like to ask, has anyone been to Pennsbury Manor? 1, 2 people.
Okay, bonus points for you too.
That's on my list of things to see, thanks to Doug Miller, because I didn't really know much about it until I started researching the site. But anyway, Doug will be speaking on William Penn and the Lenape, and perhaps give us a little more information about Pennsbury Manor. And please join me in welcoming Doug Miller.
First off, thank you for inviting me up. It got me out of my comfort zone and up here to the nosebleed section of Pennsylvania. Actually, I have a good friend that I go canoeing with every year in Nicholson, so I love Northeastern PA. And I went to school at Bloomsburg, which, you know, to people in a rural area, that's not that far. Down in the Philadelphia area, you would think it's the end of the earth.
Yes.
I'm going to start out talking about who were the Lenape and a little bit about their culture. I was really pleased to see the exhibit that you guys had put up and to hear about the work that you're doing. In the museum field, there are buzz terms, and the museum field is a profession, and there are professional people who work in that. One of the buzz terms today is DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. You guys are hitting the nail right on the head by talking about Native peoples. And for years and years and years, we didn't talk about Native peoples except they were the bad guys in the John Wayne movies. And the truth is they have an amazing culture that has been here for tens of thousands of years. And our local Lenape, there are archaeological sites directly across from Pennsbury Manor that go back probably 10,000 years. So our Lenape were here for a lot longer than the colonists who came in. When I look at the Lenape and their descendants today are the Delaware. So to call somebody Delaware, you understand that they descend from the Lenape. Does anyone know where the Delaware gets its name from, the river? Everyone thinks it's a Native American term. It's not. So there's a governor in Virginia named Thomas West. And Thomas West hires this guy to go up and map the coast. And they've already named the Chesapeake, but everything north is fair game. So as this guy sails up the coast, the first major river that he bumps into in his mapping expedition, he names after his benefactor, Thomas West, which nobody connects the dots until I tell you Thomas West's title is he's the 3rd Earl Delaware. Thus, we have a Native American group named for the title of a governor of Virginia. I think that when we look back at history, there are groups that have taken titles that were given to them and embraced them rather than fought against them. And I'll pick on William Penn and his buds at this point, the Quakers. The real name of Quakers is the Society of Friends. In the 17th century, the founder of the Quaker faith is a guy named George Fox. And George Fox asks good Quakers to go to a meeting such as this and proselytize. In Fox's view and Quakers' views, if you're not a Quaker, your soul is in jeopardy. And you need to find the inner light, which allows you to have a direct access to God. So these people would go into active Church of England services and so on, and they would be so seized by the faith as they're proselytizing and interrupting the ongoing church service that they'd start to shake. And everyone starts to call them Quakers in a derogatory way, almost like using the N-word for African Americans. Oh. However, the Quakers grabbed onto it, embraced it, and today you say Quaker and everyone knows what you're talking about. It was originally supposed to be a really derogatory term. If you go past a Quaker meeting house, which in the area that Pennsbury is, the Pennsylvania German saying of you can't swing a cat without hitting a meeting house. And my daughter is exploring her faith, and she has professed her intentions to join the Horsham Friends meeting, which is our hometown. They still use the term Quaker, but when you read the sign outside the meeting house, it says Society of Friends. So they're still staying true to George Fox. However, you're here to hear a little bit about Penn and the people that welcomed him. So I'm going to start out with a Lenape of the 17th century. In the 17th century, Lenapehoking went from the edges of Maryland down into Delaware, eastern Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and lower New York State, including Long Island. Bought Long Island for $24. Yeah, it was Lenape that sold it. At that point, Native peoples really didn't understand European land ownership. And I just had a discussion with a professor from Swarthmore who was very insistent that we had painted Penn with too golden a brush and that Native peoples didn't understand European land ownership. And my response to this professor was, I'll buy that for the first generation. I won't buy it for the second, and certainly not the third generation. Lenape, by the time Penn arrived, understood European land ownership. The Lenape are bordered by other cultural groups. To the south, they're the Powhatans in the Tidewater, Virginia area. To the west are the Susquehannock in the Susquehanna drainage. To the north are the bands of Iroquois that will ultimately confederate in the 18th century. Well, 1 year after the Pilgrims arrive, some of the Lenape along the coast look out and there are some sails there. Now, this is not an unusual thing. There have been fishing fleets coming for almost 100 years prior to this, up to the Grand Banks. And when they needed resupply, they would put in, get fresh water, try to barter for some foodstuffs. Well, these are Dutch ships. And they stop off at Cape Henlopen, purchase land from the local Lenape. Another ship goes the whole way up to the point where the Delaware is no longer navigable. The Delaware is tidal the whole way up to Trenton. So on the map where the Delaware turns, just north of that is where the tide line stops. Well, there happened to be an island between Trenton and Morrisville on the Pennsylvania side. So they set up a trading post there. They've got a trading post there, they've got a trading post at Cape Henlopen, and other ships move up the Hudson and set up Fort Orange, which is where current Albany is. This is all in Lenapehoking. Well, there's a misunderstanding down with the people at Cape Henlopen. The Dutch are great for putting up no trespassing signs or we own this land signs, so they posted their land. And they also had brought livestock. Livestock at that time was free ranging. You fenced your garden to keep the animals out. You don't fence the animals in. Well, the Lenape didn't have big draft animals. And these oxen and these horses are getting into their plowed fields and cultivated fields and eating the Lenape's food. And there's a mid-level Lenape who's walking through the woods, and he keeps walking past this sign that's made out of metal for about 6 months. Eventually he's like, well, this is obviously abandoned. I'm going to take it. I'm going to make something out of it. I'll roll it up, make a pipe, whatever. And the Dutch complained to the local delegation of Lenape. 3 days later, at least what we've pieced together, what we think happened, is the Lenape show up with the Sachem's head in a basket to present to the Dutch. What the Dutch don't understand, and in a great example of cultural misunderstanding, theft is a capital offense to the Delaware or to the Lenape. The Dutch are like, oh my gosh, we didn't mean this. In Lenape culture, you can ask for reparations. You have two choices. One would be financial reparations, trade goods, things like that, foodstuffs. The other would be in blood, and the family asks for blood. So in a surprise attack, the Lenape wipe Swannendel at Cape Henlopen off the map. The Dutch explorer De Vries finds the aftermath of this. All the animals have been beheaded. Remember, the animals are eating their farm fields and their heads are up on a pike. All the settlers have been slaughtered. It's at that point that the Dutch decide maybe we better not stay here for a while, and they abandon the place at Trenton. Fort Orange continues, and the later Dutch governor of New Amsterdam will set off what's called Kuyf's War. He basically, against the wishes of the colonists, massacres hundreds of Lenape who were in the Hudson drainage. These people ultimately will migrate and they will end up in Canada. And there are two groups of Lenape descendants in Canada today that are nationally recognized by the Canadian government. So, the Dutch are out. The next group to take a swing at colonizing are the Swedes. And the Swedes come with the idea of really making their fortune, but ultimately going home. They're not trying to build a super colony yet. And they get along famously with the Lenape. There is a trade ship that comes up the Delaware called the Squirrel. And the sailors need to resupply. They've been warned by European boats further down in the Chesapeake that are doing their fishing that there are Native Americans that are hostile, and they're wearing match coats. These would have been European-made coats that they would have traded for. The next thing you know, the crew of the Squirrel, and this is the 1630s, sees canoes headed their way. There are only 8 guys on the Squirrel. They grab what weapons they can, they man their posts, but the people in these canoes are holding up children. They're Lenape. What we believe is the people in the match coats were Susquehannock, and the Susquehannock were a major powerhouse at this point, and there's a border war going on between the Lenape and the Susquehannock. They want to put their kids somewhere safe. They think because the Squirrel has guns, they'll be safe there. The guys on the Squirrel need food. In Lenape culture, you never let your neighbor starve. So the Lenape show up with baskets of corn. The people on the Squirrel provide them with some tools, axes, adzes, things along those lines. And it starts kind of this barter system. By the time the Swedish colony gets established, there is a Swedish governor named Johan Prince. And he lived down below Westchester, around Chester. He had his home there, was called the Prinshof. And there is a small but growing Swedish colony. Meanwhile, back in the mother country, Sweden goes to war with the Dutch, and the Dutch win that war. So the Dutch are back to take over the Swedish territorial holdings. This comes in the 1650s, 1660s. That's setting the stage. It's time now to hear a little bit about William Penn and how he gets into this stuff. So I'm going to go back 2 generations in Penn's lineage. I always like to tell the story of his grandfather, Giles Penn. So Giles Penn is a mid-level merchant. He is buying stuff for his mercantile business from North Africa. So he's going back and forth on ship in the early 1600s to North Africa. Barbary pirates kidnap 200 English citizens and hold them for ransom. You guys remember when the Somali pirates grabbed some of our guys? Yeah, it's been going on for hundreds of years. Giles Penn helps negotiate the safe release of these 200 captives. For that, the King of England at that point, Charles I, is awarding him a diplomatic posting to Morocco. I bring that up because it starts the interface between the Penn family and the crown. Well, Giles is not a successful merchant. Diplomatic pay isn't that great. If you don't have money to send your kid to school, what do you do with him? You put him in the military. So Giles has a son who's named William. His firstborn son, he has joined the Royal Navy. And he actually ascends to a captaincy. He's got his own ship. And there is a little-known battle off the coast of Ireland. And Captain Penn distinguishes himself in battle. He will be awarded the rank of admiral. And at this time, he catches the eye, or she catches his eye, of a Dutch expatriate named Maria Springett. This is our William Penn's mother, so that's our William Penn's parents. 1644, the firstborn son is given the father's name, so it's William Penn Jr., that would be our William Penn. By the end of that decade, a civil war has broken out in England. Basically, you've got the crown on one side, Charles I. Charles I's shtick is, God made me king and you people should do what I say. The opposition is led by Oliver Cromwell. Their nickname is the Roundheads because of the helmets that they wear in the Civil War. They want stronger Puritan values. They feel that the Church of England has gone astray from the true path. They want a much stauncher and more austere. They also don't believe in a king. They think it should be parliamentary rule. Well, unfortunately for Charles, he loses, and his head is cut off in a public display. Oliver Cromwell names himself Lord Protector of England. I always thought that would be a great title. I could be Lord Protector of Pensbury, get it on a business card. So Cromwell sets up this stronger parliament. The sons of the king have fled. They've left what we would know as England. They're hiding in plain sight in France, or what we would know as France. Admiral Penn continues in the Royal Navy. His campaigning has not been part of the Civil War at home. It's been on the high seas against enemies of England. So he's walked that tightrope between the crown that really, he got his position through Charles I, and this new thing of Oliver Cromwell. At one point, he's accused of treason. He's locked up in the Tower. He's released. And he goes campaigning. Cromwell dies. At this point, the populace of England, who really are sick and tired of it being too Puritan, they kind of like to have fun too, decide, we like a strong parliament, but we'd like to see a king back. And again, before Charles I lost his head, he was able to breed, and he has two sons, Charles II and a younger brother, James. They are in Brittany, which we would know as France, but at that point, if you look at the map, it's part of England. They're just hiding in plain sight. So Parliament chooses 11 prominent citizens to go to Brittany to bring Charles II back and ask him to take the throne. One of those 11 citizens, whose fleet goes across the English Channel, is Admiral Penn. On board his ship is his upstart son, William. Young William has been sent to Chigwell Elementary School. It is still a school in England, and they have the room where young William had studied. In that room, he has his first vision of God, and he probably had his first near-death experience because he contracts smallpox. But there's a miracle cure, don't worry. It's called mercury. So they have him ingest mercury, which causes early pattern baldness in this 11-year-old boy. Young Penn will wear wigs the rest of his life, but it does cure him of the smallpox. He is sent off to study at Oxford. Within 6 months, he has pissed off the faculty enough that they write to Admiral Penn, say, your son's a pain in the butt, please take him home. Admiral Penn's like, what do I do with this kid? So he sends him off to study in Europe. He studies in Saumur, France, which is a Huguenot academy. I bring this up because Huguenots are big proponents of religious toleration. He spends almost 2 years in Europe, tours all over the place. He's down into Italy, he's in the German-speaking countries, he's up in Holland. He's entertained by the court of Louis. Admiral Penn is a huge hero by the time young William returns, and Daddy's grooming him to go into military service. He's actually in the Royal Navy under his dad at this point. Well, Admiral Penn and his fleet goes over to England, or across from the English Channel over to Brittany, meets with Charles II and tells you, honestly, Charles, we're not going to cut your head off like your dad. Come on back. So, in what's called the Glorious Restoration, no blood, no fighting, Charles II ascends the throne. Shortly thereafter, as happens frequently in the 17th century, the English go to war with the Dutch. Admiral Penn sails off. He is High Admiral, third highest guy in the Royal Navy at this point. On board his ship is the head of the Royal Navy, the kid brother of the king. So James is on Admiral Penn's ship. There is a wicked sea battle off the coast of Holland, where Admiral Penn's fleet spanks the Dutch. It is a sweeping English victory, and Admiral Penn takes 2 steps back, points at James, and says, "It's all about James. He was telling me what to do." Probably not true, but Admiral Penn is a good politician. Basically, James is allowed to take over the Dutch holdings in the New World. Where Lenape Hoken is New Amsterdam. James takes over New Amsterdam and rebrands it after himself, because James's title is he's the Duke of York. Thus we get New York. Well, sadly, in that campaign, Admiral Penn has had to front money to keep the battles going. There's a debt that's owed to Admiral Penn. He's taken 11,000 pounds sterling out of his own pocket to pay for the commissary, the feeding of the troops, and their wages, because Parliament has cut off military spending for a brief time. Or as I like to put it, the legislative branch is not playing nicely with the executive branch. It went on back then too. So, at this point, Admiral Penn gets sick. He and his son have seen some very trying times in London. 1665, plague ravages London. Tens of thousands die. A year later, a cleansing fire sweeps through, the fire of London, in which 2/3 of London are consumed by fire. The fire is closing in on Admiral Penn's home. There's only minutes to spare between getting out alive and maybe losing everything. But the Admiral and young William pause to save one precious thing from the house. Do you think it's the Admiral's suit of armor from battle, the decorations he's been given? It's the wine. The two of them dig a great big deep hole in the backyard and bury all the wine to protect it from the fire. And we know this because Admiral Penn's next door neighbor was a voracious diarist. His name is Samuel Pepys, and his diaries are still in print. Pepys worked for Admiral Penn, and he didn't like Admiral Penn very much. And he writes a little bit about some tension between young William and the Admiral. Well, a year later, there is a mutiny of Irish troops who are on an estate or near an estate where Admiral Penn has land in Ireland. Did you ever notice how the Irish don't like the English very much? So Admiral Penn does all this great stuff for England, and what the king decides to do is boot out an Irish lord and give the admiral his estates. What could go wrong? So there's a mutiny with Irish troops. Young William is dispatched by his dad to go help subdue this mutiny, and there's a battle in a place called Carrickfergus. Our William Penn sees combat and is written up in dispatches as being pretty accomplished with a sword. While in Ireland, he bumps into a guy that he and his dad had bumped into before. He's a Quaker orator named Thomas Lowe. When he and his dad bumped into Lowe the first time, they invited Thomas Lowe back to the Admiral's home. And Admiral Penn, the grizzled warhorse that he was so moved by his oration about the faith that he was brought to tears at the dinner table. At this point, young Penn decides, I want to be a Quaker. And it breaks his father's heart. His father canes him, throws him out of the house, reconciles, and so on. And about 1670, Admiral Penn passes away without cashing in on that debt that's owed to his family. Meanwhile, the Lenape back here are starting to have to get used to English rule. You have a colony developing across the Delaware from us of West Jersey. West Jersey is a Quaker enclave. There are 11 proprietary interests. East Jersey is against the Atlantic, West Jersey is against the Delaware, and this would be the 1670s. Well, two of these Quakers who have bought into this proprietary interest are in London, and they hate each other, and they can't come to terms with how we're gonna rule this West Jersey place. So they asked this guy who had studied law at Lincoln's before getting kicked out of Oxford, a fellow Quaker to help them negotiate a settlement between the two of them. In the Quaker faith, if you have a dispute, you take it to meeting, you don't go to the courts. So William Penn helps negotiate, and he gets interested in this idea of this West Jersey place. He's got all this money he inherited from Dad, so he's like, well, I'm going to buy in. One of the 11 proprietary interests of West Jersey in the 1670s is our William Penn. Quakers being Quakers take a long while to get to consensus. 5 years later, they still can't agree on how they're going to rule West Jersey. Penn has written some of the founding legislation for this colony. And Penn gets this idea. He's been looking at another colony over here. It is a colony that was set up for religious separatists. It's called Maryland. See, there were all these Catholics in England, and the Church of England really did not like Catholics. So Charles I, the guy that lost his head, is like, I have an opportunity to get rid of a bunch of those Catholics and found a new colony. So the Calvert family, Catholics, but Englishmen, establish in the 1630s Maryland. Maryland goes up to the 40th parallel at this point. Well, Penn's kind of watching this, seeing that West Jersey isn't going anywhere. He's like, I could do a better job on my own. And there's this debt that's owed to his family because of Admiral Penn's loaning money to the crown. So, in 1680, William Penn approaches Charles II. There's negotiation through the fall, and in March of 1681, after James signs off on the deal, you see, James is the guy that had sway to the land. New York now goes the whole way down until it bumps into Maryland. And James is like, sure, why not? Except I like the idea of this Newcastle place, so give me a 12-mile circumference around Newcastle. Have you ever looked at the Pennsylvania map and seen that semicircular part down the southeastern corner? That's because James wanted a 12-mile buffer around Newcastle. It goes back to the 1680s. They've drawn up the document. Charles II asks William Penn, what will you call your colony? William Penn proudly stands up and says, New Wales. Yeah, same response from the crowd. The king had an advisor who was a Welshman who hated the Penn family. And he takes the king aside, he says, Charles, don't do it, it's a bad idea. So Charles II goes to William Penn, he says, give me an alternative, I'm not hot on that New Wales thing. So William Penn says Sylvania, in Latin, woodlands. Charles says, I like it. However, our country, England, owes a debt to your father that we can never fully repay. So we're going to name it Pennsylvania in his honor. How many of you thought that Pennsylvania was named for the Quaker guy? I think the great irony of what William Penn in a private letter will call the holy experiment, this ideal colony of religious toleration, it's based on military debt. That same letter he writes to one of his best friends at the time, Robert Turner. It's March 5th, 1681. And he writes in it that everyone is going to think it's a vanity on my part. And today, many people do think Pennsylvania is named for the Quaker guy, not the English war hero. He also writes in that letter, may God bless it and make it the seat of a nation. And historians have latched onto that like a lamprey on a landlocked salmon, and they won't let it go. And Penn never intended for anyone else other than Robert Turner to read this letter. But it does give a hint of the idea that William Penn had going into it. Now I'm finally going to get back to Penn and the Lenape. And I tend to be terribly disorganized with stuff, which is why I'm talking off the top of my head. But there were a couple pieces that I printed that I wanted to kind of quote from. So Penn gets his colony. He's got to figure out, what the heck am I going to do with this thing? But he needs to get the word to the people who are living in the Delaware drainage. We feel it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 to 1,200 Europeans of different descent. Penn is a brilliant linguist. He writes and speaks 5 different languages. So he writes letters of introductions to the Dutch, to the Swedes, and to all these different people. He also writes a letter to the King of the Canadas. My friends, there is one great God and power that has made the world and all therein, to whom you, I, and all people owe their being and well-being, and to whom you and I must one day give an account for all we do in this world. This great God has written laws in our hearts, which we are taught and commanded to love and help and do good to one another, and not do harm and mischief unto one another. Now this great God has been pleased to make me concerned in your parts of the world, and the king of the country where I live has given unto me a great province therein, but I desire to enjoy it with your love and consent, that we may always live together as neighbors and friends. Else what would the great God say to us, who has made us not to devour and destroy one another, but to live soberly and kindly together in this world? Now, I would have you well observe that I am very sensible of the unkindness and injustice that has been too much exercised towards you by people of these parts of the world, who have sought themselves to make great advantages upon you, rather than be examples of justice and goodness unto you, which I hear has been a matter of trouble to you and caused great grudgings and animosities, sometimes to the shedding of blood, which has made the great God angry. But I am not such a man, as is well known in my own country. I have a great love and regard towards you, and I desire to win and gain your love and friendship by a kind, just, and peaceful life. And the people I send are of the same mind, and shall in all things behave themselves accordingly. And if anything shall offend you or your people, you shall have a full and speedy satisfaction, for the same by an equal number of honest men on both sides, that by no means you may have just occasion to be offended against them. I shall shortly come to you myself, at what time we may more largely and freely confer and discourse of these matters. In the meantime, I have sent my commissioners to treat with you about land and a firm league of peace. Let me desire you to be kind to them and the people, and receive the presents and tokens which I have sent as a testimony of my goodwill to you and my resolution to live justly, peaceably, and friendly with you. I am your friend, William Penn. This is one of my favorite letters by Penn. So, Penn's cousin is Captain William Markham. He's a seafaring captain. Captain Markham carries that letter to the Lenape. He sails up to that abandoned Dutch trading post between Morrisville and Trenton, and he puts in on the Pennsylvania side of the river, because remember, West Jersey is already established. He needs to buy the land on that west side. There is a place in Morrisville called the Greystones, and there is actually a monument to this. That is the first land purchase in Penn's name from the Lenape. It was all in trade goods, and that same professor that I was telling you I was having disagreements with said, well, you know, they just give cheap trade goods. There's an accounting of exactly what trade goods were given by Penn to the Lenape and the cost. The cost was 2,100 pounds sterling. The whole colony is established on 16,000 pounds sterling. This is one land purchase. Penn was trying to be square with these people. There are things in it like match coats, duffels, fathoms of wampum. Fathoms are 6 foot lengths. There are combs, mirrors, hose, adzes, anchors of beer, guns, ammunition. When you think about guns, everyone thinks warfare. One of the laments that Johann Prince had was that they didn't have enough trade goods to buy a stockpile of beaver pelts that the Lenape had. 6,000 to 8,000 beaver pelts they had to let go to other people, other traders who did have the trade goods. Supply and demand. We hear all about the chain of supply today. Yeah, they had problems back then too. So Penn, I always like this letter because in my mind, it shows where his head was at before he arrives. When he gets here in the summer of 1683, William Penn decides, I want to see this place, this Pennsylvania. So he goes down to the Schuylkill, hops in a dugout canoe with 2 Lenape guides, and paddles almost the whole way up to Reading. And if you know the right place along 422, there is a stone obelisk to the furthest west that reputedly William Penn had made it with these 2 Lenape guides. He visits Native American village sites. He actually is gifted, we're not sure whether it's seeds or actually little seedlings, but peach trees. His gardener at his developing manor house called Pennsbury, which is 25 miles up the Delaware from where Philadelphia is. And I frequently have people say, well, why didn't he build in Philadelphia? The fast answer, Philadelphia was a vision in his mind when he set aside that land. West Jersey was already established, and just below Pennsbury on the New Jersey side of the river is the town of Bristol, which was a port town and had a market, and that's where the yearly meeting of Quakers were. So with the little school kids that come through, I say, okay, you know, the market town, that's your local convenience store, that's your Wawa. The yearly meeting, that's your church. And I-95 was the Delaware. Markham probably picked the siting of Pennsbury. And again, on the map over there, it's right where the Delaware turns. The inside part of the turn, which is where Penn settled, is the best farmland around. Whenever the river floods, it erodes the bank on the New Jersey side and it deposits all that great soil on the Pennsylvania side. And I have a fabulous gardener at the historic site that I work at, and I always tease people that she could plant a brick and it would grow. But it really is fabulous farmland, and in the earliest deeds, there are references to the Indian fields that were there. By this point, the Lenape have moved from hunters and gatherers, although there are 2 kind of different schools of thought among anthropologists about what the lifeways were of the Delaware or the Lenape at this point. Herb Kraft was an archaeologist who worked in New Jersey, famous, well-received, wrote a book on the Delaware. Sadly, he has passed. And his model, which is based on New Jersey archaeology, there are well-known areas that were Delaware farms or Lenape farms. Meanwhile, on the other side of the river is Marshall Becker, and he taught at Penn and taught at Westchester, and he said the Lenape never moved out of the hunter-gatherer phase, and they would go out in small bands, and they would hunt, and they would come together at times of high harvest, like when the shad are running up the Delaware. You can make an argument based on the archaeology for either, but I tend to buy into Herb Kraft's model, not Marshall Becker's model. There is an archaeological site just north of Pennsbury at a local park called Brownsburg, where there was a fish processing center, and they would net hundreds of shad and actually process them into kind of this gooey fish bowl and bury them for long-term storage. When winter would come, many times people would move out of the villages along the streams. It's colder and damper along the Delaware, and you move up where the headwaters are to set up these hunting camps, and they would sustain themselves during the starving time or the winter months. So those are the different models. Penn gets here, and he sets out with the encouragement of Charles II to purchase the land fairly from the Lenape. Reason being, in the 10 years prior to William Penn getting here, there are 3 terrible wars that surround the area that we're in right now. If you go down south, starting on the 2nd year at Jamestown, the people of Jamestown really piss off the local Indians by force of arms, stealing food from them during what's called the starving time. It gets so bad when the warfare is there and they have to be in there that there is archaeological evidence of cannibalism among the earliest settlers of Jamestown. There will be 5 Anglo-Powhatan Wars leading up to the Revolution. Central Pennsylvania, the Calverts of Maryland, down around Havre de Grace, have been trading with the Susquehannock, who bring their furs and so on down the river. Their trade rivals are the Iroquois, northern branches of the Susquehanna up in New York State. 1674, the Calverts decide, maybe we better not give these people guns anymore. And the Iroquois come down and they stomp all over the Susquehannock. The Susquehannock pre-contact had villages of 3,000 to 5,000 people. They were small cities. Today there are no descendants of the Susquehannock left. And the fur trade war is the downturn of the Susquehannock. To the north, there is a charismatic Native American leader named King Philip. King Philip's daddy is Massasoit. Massasoit is the chief who propagates the first Thanksgiving with the Pilgrims and getting along with the Pilgrims. One generation later, King Philip will touch off a war that will depopulate New England by fully 1/3. A third of the natives and a third of the colonial people will die in King Philip's war. Wars are expensive undertaking, and the crown does not want those expenses, both in manpower and in finance. Penn is a Quaker. He's grown up in a military tradition. He understands the military well. But as a Quaker, that's not an option. And he has a business plan. His business plan is he's going to buy the land and then sell it at a markup to all these people. And his niche are the religiously disassociated. He is actively pamphleting in different languages across Europe and this is tongue-in-cheek, guys, all the whack jobs of Europe. My ancestors were high on the whack job scale. We were Swiss Mennonites. And I was like, yeah, those Mennonites are crazies. So, but Penn opens up Pennsylvania. And in many countries, the middling sort, middle class like ourselves, couldn't own land. All of a sudden, you can buy land on the cheap from William Penn. He, in turn, has purchased it from the Lenape. He is a horrendous financial manager. He is hemorrhaging money on developing this colony. And he's living a very opulent life. Later generations of Quakers will adopt the saying, the best sort but plain. That wasn't part of the game plan during William Penn's day. So he's living like a rich guy. When you read his account ledgers, he's having the best wine shipped from Europe and so on. 1684, his spies tell him that Lord Baltimore is rushing back to speak to the crown. The Calverts had touched off this war with the Susquehannock. This basically settles a division between the Susquehannock and the Lenape over boundaries. The Lenape are still here, the Susquehannock are fading. But the southern boundary of Pennsylvania is not codified. William Penn arrives and proudly tells Lord Baltimore that the 40th parallel runs through about where present-day Baltimore is. In truth, it's about where the Pennsylvania Turnpike is. And Lord Baltimore chooses to disagree, and I tell my college interns that if William Penn had spontaneously combusted, Lord Baltimore wouldn't have tinkled on him. So Penn has to rush back and plead his case to the crown. Charles II, remember whose daddy put him on the throne, remembers the Penns and sides with William Penn, but he doesn't codify it in writing. He gives Penn sway over the lower counties, which we would know as Delaware. So Penn now has a hand in West Jersey, his own colony of Pennsylvania. He's doing kind of a land grab on Maryland, and he's got the lower counties. He is the single largest landholder in England and in the English-speaking world. He owns more land than the crown does at this point. So he goes through all sorts of intrigues when he's back there. Charles dies. Kid brother James ascends the throne. Kid brother James has learned a new faith while he was in France. He's an out-of-the-closet Catholic. Well, James's son-in-law is staunch with the Church of England and starts to raise armies with his daughter, James's daughter, William and Mary. And James decides, you know, being king isn't that great. I'm going to go back to Brittany. So he advocates, and we have the William and Mary period. William Penn is accused of treason, and he is jailed in the Tower. There are two capital offenses in English law, treason and murder. So he's under a death sentence. He pleads his case, is released on sort of house arrest. And there's almost 2 years where we're not really sure what he's doing. But shortly after, and this is in the 1690s, he loses the love of his life. When he's in his late 20s, he meets Guliana Springett, who is a fabulous beauty, a fellow Quaker. He has many children by her. His favorite son, Springett, is being groomed to take over. He loses Guli. 6 months later, he loses Springett. He's devastated. Within 2 years, he catches the eye of the daughter of one of the first purchasers for Pennsylvania. First purchasers buy $5,000 as investment, or 5,000 acres as investment property, sight unseen. The guy's name is Thomas Callahill. His daughter, the only one of 9 children to survive to adulthood, is Hannah. Penn starts to court her. She kind of brushes him off. A third party gets involved in the courtship, starts to write to Hannah, Penn's daughter from the first marriage, who is 6 years younger than her future stepmother. Hey, take a second look at Dad, he's pretty okay. And the two have a lifelong friendship. Eventually, Penn wears Hannah down. She is, and the Callahills are fabulously wealthy. Penn, of course, is hemorrhaging money. But they have a very loving marriage. 1699, the populace of Pennsylvania really don't like the way Penn has set up the colony. They want more of a say-so in how they're going to do things. Penn has taken inspiration from the Lenape, and he's looked things over. When they first write to him, everyone says, Bill, this government isn't working for us. He's like, guys, I got it right the first time. Everyone's like, no, Bill, you didn't. How he had set it up was the governor comes up with laws. He calls together a legislature who ratifies the laws and passes them to the people. That's his first frame of government. And that's how these first colonists, all the whack jobs of Europe coming over, were operating. He comes in 1699 and begins to revisit government. He is inspired in part by England, comes up with a two-party system, like Senate and House, or House of Commons and House of Lords, a chief executive on the top. Laws come up from the people to those two houses, they ratify them and move them up to the governor. So he's given up a lot of control in doing this. Basically, just under 90 years later, there'll be a group of guys that meet in Philadelphia that are looking for good examples because their first stab at government is an abysmal failure too, the Articles of Confederation. And they will take inspiration from Penn's frame of government, which he calls the Charter of Privileges. Later it gets known as the Charter of Liberties, and 50 years after it becomes the law of Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania legislature is so smitten with it that they decide to cast a bill in its honor. It has a crack in it, and it hangs in Philadelphia, and nobody remembers that the Liberty Bell was cast for Penn's Charter of Liberties. Well, while Penn is back here, he meets with many delegations. He continues the purchase of land from the Lenape. And he has bought land the whole way over to the Susquehanna in kind of a line moving southwest till it bumps into the Susquehanna. In 1701, Penn has a creditor who has been loaning him money, because remember, he's a terrible financial manager, who calls him the chit. This man's name is Philip Ford. He is a subordinate of Penn's. He had lent Penn $5,000 sterling. According to Penn, Philip Ford has been embezzling from Penn for years. According to Philip Ford, I lent this guy good money. He signed over the deed of Pennsylvania as credit, and I'm calling in his marker. So Penn has to go back. He tells Hannah and his daughter Letitia, who are at Pennsbury, I'll be right back. They write, do not leave us in this godforsaken wilderness. We're coming with you, which is fortuitous because Penn will never return to Pennsylvania. As the word spreads, the Lenape get wind of this. 200 Lenape, sachems and their entourages, descend on Pennsbury Manor, for a 3-day party down on the lawn that is recorded as a powwow. And I always thought that was a 20th century term, but in 1701, somebody who witnessed it records it as a powwow. And a letter is written with other natives that are with the Lenape to the King of England. So if you'll indulge me on another piece, if I can find it. Here we go. October 2nd, 1701. We, the kings and sachems of the ancient nations of the Savannah and the Susquehanna Indians, understanding that our loving and good friend and brother William Penn is to our great grief and trouble of all Indians in these parts, obliged to go back to England to speak with the great king and his sachems about his government. And we can do no less than acknowledge that he has not only always just been very kind to us, as well as our ancient kings and sachems deceased, and careful to keep a good correspondence with us, not suffering us to receive any wrong from any of the people under his government, giving us, as is well known, his house for our home, and at all times freely entertaining us at his own cost, and often filling us with many presents and necessary goods for our clothing and other accommodations, besides what he has paid us for our lands, which no governor ever did before him. And we hope and desire that the great king of the English will be good and kind to him and his children, and grant that they may always govern these parts. And then we shall have confidence that we and our children and the people will be well used and be encouraged to continue to live among the Christians according to the agreement that he and we have solemnly made for us and our posterity, as long as the sun and the moon shall endure. One head, one mouth, one heart. We could say much more of his good counsel and instructions, which he has often given us and our people to live sober and virtuous life, in the best way to please the great God and be happy here and forever. But let this suffice to the king and his wise sachems, and love our good friend and brother, William Penn. I always like to kind of bracket my talk about Penn and the Indians with those two letters, because Penn sets out a structure where the colonists have to recognize the rights of indigenous people. If each of you bought land along the Delaware, you still have to give the Lenape access to the Delaware for fishing and hunting. They can't destroy your gardens, they can't destroy your houses and so on, but they may pass through. Once he makes payment, he continues to offer trade goods. And you might say buying favors, but in Lenape culture, material things are not as critical as we have today. There is a letter that Penn writes to the Committee of the Society of Free Traders, and he talks about how if a gift is given to a Lenape, it may pass through 20 hands before it sticks. And he uses the example of a gun. And a firearm is a critical tool to hunters, people who need to get those furs. We don't have time, but there's a whole letter to the Society of Free Traders, which writes about the province of Pennsylvania, about the land, the trees, the animals, but also about the indigenous people. He talks about the matrimonial system of the Lenape. He talks about their governmental system. And he respected that governmental system. When he first arrives, he sets it up that if there are aggrieved parties, that both groups with an equal number of people will meet, 6 people on each side, to discuss those. Sadly, before he leaves here, there are already cracks where settlers are saying, we don't want these people crossing our land. And the correspondence exists, and Penn is incredulous. He said, you signed on the dotted line on this deed that this is how we're going to live, and this is how we're going to live. Later generations, which Penn, to finish out his story, he will end up not settling with Philip Ford because Ford will die first. He will go to court with Ford's widow. He will end up in debtor's prison after being bailed out, basically, by fellow Quakers who admired him. He continues on, he's got his holdings, but he decides, you know, I'm losing money on this Pennsylvania place. So he tries to sell Pennsylvania back to the Queen. Queen Anne, have I got a deal for you, a fully developed colony for the low, low price of 16,000 pounds sterling? And of course, Queen Anne, this is 1710, says, I already got some royal colonies, I don't need another one. In desperation, next year, he drops the purchase price to the original amount of money that his dad had laid out 50 years previously. I'll sell it to you for 11,000 pounds sterling, Anne. And Anne says, yeah, sure, why not? Before he can sign the document, he's seized by stroke. He and his wife are coming back from settling the estate of his late father-in-law. Interestingly, Thomas Callaghill did not make his son-in-law the executor. Remember, he's a terrible financial manager. He made his daughter the executor, so Penn couldn't touch the money. Unfortunately, it gets tied up in legal proceedings, and Hannah can't get out from under this financial mess that is Pennsylvania. The son from the first marriage who survives contests it, and the courts have it tied up, and it will be tied up for 15 years. The son will die before it's settled. They will side with Hannah, and Pennsylvania will pass to Hannah and 3 sons from Hannah's and William's union. At the point that Penn dies, the Lenape send a fur robe lined with turkey feathers to comfort her in her mourning. So there is still this reverence that the Lenape have for Penn. There are financial matters that are crushing the Penn family. And after Hannah dies, the 3 sons purchase more land to sell at a markup. They try to set up a lottery. Quakers don't gamble. It's a Quaker-dominated legislature. So that get-rich-quick scheme falls flat. They need more land because there is a population explosion in Pennsylvania. So they propagate what's called the walking purchase. The walking purchase essentially is land adjacent to the land that they just bought. It also takes in some of the upper parts of the Delaware. And the deal was as far as a man could walk in a day and a half. They try to buy the land, the Lenape turned them down. A year later, the eldest son comes from England and, surprise, a governmental copy of a deed that reputedly William Penn worked out with their ancestors. Oh, there's not a real copy, or not the original, it's just a governmental copy, and nobody whose signature is on it is living to attest to whether it's real or not. And the deal is as far as a man can walk in a day and a half, and the Delaware are expecting, or Lenape, they are expecting people to walk due north. James Logan is the Penn's land agent over here. He has come over as William Penn's secretary in 1699 sea voyage here and stayed. He and his brother-in-law had bought 100 acres of land from the Lenape, but it doesn't have clear English title. Surprisingly, the walking purchase takes in his land as well as what the Penns want to have. So the Lenape are understanding that people will go due north, turn at a 45-degree angle into the Delaware. What Logan does is cut a path northwest so that 45-degree angle becomes far more severe. And from near where Washington's Crossing is, inland from there, there's a Quaker meeting house at Wrightstown. That's where the walkers start. Logan has hired the equivalent of Olympic sprinters. There is a sheriff who is mounted to go along, and there are Delaware. Half a day into it, the Delaware drop out and say, this is BS. One guy makes it the whole way to Mauch-Chunk, which we will know as Jim Thorpe, and then the 45-degree angle into the river. It's a huge land swindle, and it basically displaces all the Lenape that are in here. The Lenape try to protest through English channels, and they are not given satisfaction. When the French and Indian War comes, they align themselves with the French. At the end of the French and Indian War, some of them participated in Pontiac's rebellion, Pontiac being a charismatic Native American leader who's trying to bring together a Native army to throw back the English, the flood tide that's coming. He is unsuccessful. He's defeated at the Battle of Bushy Run. The revolution comes. Washington is looking for allies. The first group to sign an allegiance with the fledgling United States are our Lenape. Now they're known as Delaware. My spin on it is they still want to take a sharp stick and stick it in the eye of the English, which they did very well during the Revolution. Today, when I went to Oklahoma to visit two different branches of the Delaware, the community center in Bartlesville is covered with pictures of Delaware in their military uniforms going back to the advent of photography. They are still very proud of their service in the US military. And I was reading their tribal newspaper a few years ago, and one of their sons had brought back a flag that he had flown over Fallujah when he served with the 75th Rangers, which is one of our elite ranger units. So they're still serving today. I know I covered a lot of ground really quickly, and I don't want to keep you guys hostage forever, but I thought I would open it up for some Q&A if you have any questions.
What happened to Penn's sons? Why weren't they nicer people in dealing with the Lenape?
So that's kind of a hard question. The sons, I think, were children of privilege, and they were used to having all the best things and getting their way. None of them continue to be Quakers. They all go back to Church of England. And so they're not being guided by the inner light and the Quaker vision. There were also crushing financial issues facing the Penn family. And when the eldest, who is John, Hannah is very pregnant for her sea voyage to the US or to Pennsylvania in 1699. She will give birth in Chester to John, who picks up the nickname of John the American. He's the firstborn of that marriage. And when he comes, the Lenape are expecting, okay, he's the firstborn, he's going to be like his dad and so on. But as the sort of patriarch of the family at that point, he's got these crushing financial items to deal with. And the path out that they can see is more land and selling it. And they're being stymied by the Lenape saying, we don't want to move anymore. We're done. We're tapping out. We want to keep our land. So that, I think, is the motivation for why they did it. You can say greed, but it's really trying to maintain the family name, the family position, and so on. It's more than just the wealth. This April, I did share a story. I know you had Susan here to talk about the Lenape earlier this year. Well, I worked with Susan on a project at Pennsbury. There is a federal law called the Native American Graves Repatriation Act, and museums and universities that hold cultural remains from burial sites and human remains are duty-bound to disclose that and to try to find the descendants of the people whose remains they are. So all 5 branches of the Delaware came to Pennsbury. There was 4 days of ceremonial preparation of 180 of their ancestors, which they had interred on site. We are in the process of deeding the burial ground to the Delaware, so they're not on Pennsylvania, state of Pennsylvania land, they're on Delaware land. It's probably the most significant thing that I'll get to do in my career. I was not prepared for how emotionally moved I would be. I just thought I'd be an outside observer. But these 5 different branches, that the walking purchase shatters the unity of the Lenape and ends Lenape Hoken. It starts them on what Native peoples will call the forced removal. The group that I'm closest with will move south and they'll bump into the Cherokee. Guess who gets to walk along the Trail of Tears, headed west? And there's another group that enters through Kansas and ends up in Anadarko. Both these groups are in Oklahoma. The Muncie, who are up here, first move to be with the Mohawk, and then from the Mohawks they move out to Stockbridge, Wisconsin. And in meeting them, it was an interesting cultural experience for me because the people from Wisconsin are lumberjacks. And I had a father and son, Caleb being the son. And we had to move remains and so on. And you would have thought I was this kid's best friend when I gave him the keys to the golf cart so he could drive the golf cart around Pennsbury Manor and help move the ancestors. But it was a fascinating opportunity to work with them. I worked with the assistant chief of the Delaware Tribe of Indians. His name is Jeremy Johnson. He is now their cultural officer. He resigned that position to take on a position at another Lenape that I know, or Delaware that I know, just retired from. And a comment that Jeremy made really resonated with me. He said, I hate it when people tell me my history. So I listened a lot. And I'm still very much on the learning curve because my ambition is to tell the story of William Penn and the Indians, but to tell it from the Indians' point of view. And in the Midwest, like in the Northeast, we're all politically correct and we all say Native American. If you ask somebody from Oklahoma, they say, oh yeah, I'm an Indian. They don't say Native American. And it took a little bit of getting used to, and I had to change my parlance in working with them. But I found them to be a wonderful, warm, forgiving. Museums are at the top, along with universities, of places that ravaged their grave sites. And in their belief tradition, their ancestors need to rest near where they lived to find their way in the spirit world. And there were smudge pots. There was I allowed them to build a sweat lodge, and they actually asked me to sweat with them, which was after a full day of stuff, and I was in a suit, and I said, you bet your butt I will. So I kicked off my loafers and, you know, my tie and my shirt, and climbed into the sweat lodge with them. And having just a brief glimpse, Native peoples have been objectified. We have traditionally lumped them together. It's like calling someone a European. A Finn is different than a Pole, who's different than a Spaniard. And they all have these wonderful, deep cultural identities. And I would encourage anyone that's interested. The Delaware Tribe of Indians has their own website. They have a talking dictionary. They're headquartered in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. So, you know, if you're curiosity seekers, just see what they're up to. Any other questions? Yes?
So was it the sons, the Penn sons, that had to deal with the issue with the Connecticut thing?
So sons, one son and grandsons, so which, you know, ultimately will lead to the Wyoming massacre. And when I tend to be a little cynical at times, and when the bottom fell out of state funding and the state agency that I worked for was being downsized in the Rendell administration, I wrote to my executive director and I said, you know, Virginia claimed Western Pennsylvania and Connecticut claimed the Northeast, why don't we give it back to them? It never made it to the governor, so. Other questions, guys? Thank you so much for your attention.